I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach. This quote by Upton Sinclair accurately depicts the relationship between his novel The Jungle and the passage of federal food safety legislation in the United States. The Gilded Age, taking its name from Mark Twain's The Gilded Age written in 1873, was a period of industrial prosperity in the late 19th century United States, but at the cost of a massive wealth gap between capitalists and the working class. Business owners profited like never before with the rise of industries, while their labor was driven into despair with low wages and harsh, unsanitary working conditions. At the same time, the large influx of immigrants, comprising much of the working class, would often find themselves in a vermin-infested tenement in the crowded part of a city that they'd share with those of their likeness. The United States' laissez-faire economic policy, holding that the government should minimize economic regulations, was what made this unfavorable status of immigrants in the working class altogether possible. What laissez-faire also made room for, however, was the fact that inspections of slaughtered livestock and meat products were a rarity. The exception for this was meat products intended for exportation per a law signed by President Benjamin Harrison in 1890. This, of course, didn't address the rights of domestic consumers, and with what little inspections were required of the beef trust, as it had been called, it would often find ways around the inspections for better profits, proving irresponsible. As Sarah Lohman, author of 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine, puts it,
there were stories of people distracting the inspector who was there to check for tuberculosis in cows, so that cows that they knew were tubercular could just be passed through and end up in the cooling cars.
There was also not yet a law of which any inspection could serve as the enforcement in the first place, that is, a federal pure food law. Out of the wariness of injuries and deaths from contaminated foods and medicines with unspecified ingredients arose the pure food movement. Beginning in the 1880s, this movement was headed by Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley. Wiley was the chief chemist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and although his main task was to support new agricultural industries, his passion was developing tests for food purity. To that end, he began testing food preservatives on a group of human volunteers called the Poison Squad. When these subjects fell ill after consuming the food preservatives, national attention was drawn to the need for federal food safety legislation. Despite this, over 100 pure food bills introduced to Congress through Wiley's work were killed. Perhaps it was due to members of Congress getting huge amounts of money from food and drink interests not to pass anything, says Deborah Blum, author of The Poison Squad, One Chemist's Single-Minded Crusade for Food Safety at the Turn of the 20th Century. With that in mind, did consumers even have a right to pure food? If not Congress or the food industry, who was going to take responsibility to ensure that? In the summer of 1904, Upton Sinclair, a 25-year-old novelist who recently begun studying socialist theory, had heard of a labor strike in Chicago's Union stockyards within Chicago's meatpacking district referred to as Packingtown. News of the labor strike had appeared in the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason. When the strike failed, Sinclair wrote an article to the Appeal entitled, "You have lost the strike, and now what are you going to do about it?" which was distributed as both a front-page article and a broadside. In it, Sinclair delivers to the workers a familiar socialist message about the handful of men who own all the instruments and means of production, exploiting diligent laborers for a profit. Impressed by the article, the Appeal agreed to give Sinclair the $500 needed for him to write a direct expose of industrial abuses faced by laborers, so Sinclair had taken it upon himself to visit Packingtown and study for himself the despair of its laborers. Sinclair's horrific sights in Packingtown soon became reflected in serial publications of The Jungle, the title being a metaphor for capitalism, in the Appeal to Reason newspaper. According to Sinclair, The Jungle will set forth the breaking of human hearts by a system which exploits the labor of men and women for profits. It will shake the popular heart and blow the top off of the industrial tea kettle. The first installment of The Jungle was printed on February 25, 1905, and the last on November 4, 1905. However, per Sinclair's request, The Jungle was published in book form by Doubleday, Page & Company on February 26, 1906, widely recognized by the popular press and selling over 150,000 copies within its first year. This publicity can nonetheless be attributed not to the depiction of a system which exploits the labor of men and women for profits, but to a vivid illustration of the means by which the reader's food was turned into something quote-unquote consumable. The Jungle aims to tell the story of Jurgis Rudkus, a Lithuanian immigrant who lives in Chicago's Packingtown with his father, his wife, and his wife's family. They, along with other immigrant workers, are faced with terrible conditions in the workplace despite a lack of sufficient income, giving meaning to the term wage slavery used by Sinclair throughout the novel. Despite his misfortunes, Jurgis ends up finding hope, and this is because he joins the socialist movement. Therefore, from a literary analytical standpoint, the Jungle is mainly a proponent of socialism. But from a consumer standpoint, the Jungle offers the depiction of a vile, disease-inducing sewer from which what the reader puts into their body flows. Such a depiction is prominent when the novel, on page 79, reads, "There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. And the packers would put poisoned bread out for them, they would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together." When it comes to the adulteration of meat products, Sinclair also writes on page 79 that Jonas had told them how the meat that was taken out of pickle would often be found sour, and how they would rub it up with soda to take away the smell, and sell it to be eaten on free lunch counters, also of all the miracles of chemistry which they performed, giving to any sort of meat, fresh or salted, whole or chopped, any color and any flavor and any odor they chose. A connection between this kind of deception and the message about the plight of laborers that Sinclair had hoped to deliver is made when he writes on page 58 that the other men, who worked in the tank rooms full of steam, fell into the vats. When they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days, till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Dunham's pure beef lard. After reading such a gruesome depiction of the meat production process, President Theodore Roosevelt sent Labor Commissioner Charles Neal and social reformer James Reynolds to investigate Chicago's packing town. Included in the Neal-Reynolds report on their investigation is this: "Nothing shows more strikingly the general indifference to matters of cleanliness and sanitation than do the privies for both men and women. These privies usually ventilate into the workroom. Washing sinks are either not furnished at all or are small and dirty. Neither are towels, soap, or toilet paper provided. Men and women return directly from these places to plunge their unwashed hands into the meat to be converted into such products as sausages, dried beef, and other compounds. Hence, in some cases, the fumes of the urine swell the sum of nauseating odors arising from the dirty, blood-soaked, rotting wooden floors, fruitful culture beds for the disease germs of men and animals." When Sinclair had gotten a hold of this Neal-Reynolds report, he leaked its findings to the New York Times in May of 1906. Around the same time, meat sales in the U.S. were beginning to drop. Germany and France had banned American meat products, and Britain had banned imports of American meat products. The need for legislative action was bigger than ever. In other words, particularly President Roosevelt's in a letter addressing Congress on the condition of Chicago's packing town, under the existing law, it is wholly impossible to secure satisfactory results. So, on June 30th, 1906, within 5 months of the Jungle's publication, both the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act were passed by Congress and signed by President Roosevelt, making for the first federal food safety laws in United States history for domestic consumers. The Meat Inspection Act in both foreign and interstate commerce requires inspections throughout the entirety of the meat production process. The Pure Food and Drug Act prevents the manufacture or sale of misbranded, adulterated, or poisonous food, drugs, and alcohol.
Both of those acts are part of the progressive movement in response to basically quality of life based on Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It's trying to regulate what was a totally unregulated marketplace. And so people were eating and drinking things without knowing what was in those things, where and how they were produced, the cleanliness of the factories or places where they were produced. To do this quickly, you had a philosophy that was based on the invisible hand, that regulation was unnecessary because the market would take care of itself. And then this was a new way of thinking in the progressive era that was, well, the market doesn't always take care of issues like this. And when public health and public safety are at risk, we need to do something to make sure there's regulation. And both of these are enforced by the agencies under the executive branch. So in this case, it would be the Food and Drug Administration in both cases.
These regulations, each with the purpose of affirming consumers' rights in the United States, are largely in part to the zealous actions of Upton Sinclair, feats of responsibility that were able to achieve what both the profit-hungry legislature and a 2.5-decade-long movement never could have without them. However, as of March 2025, the U.S. presidential administration has cut federal funding from the Department of Agriculture that helps schools and food banks purchase from local farms and ranches. Officials at the Food Bank of Southeastern Virginia and the Eastern Shore state that their program allowed them to purchase fresh, locally sourced food from farmers in our region. Having in mind that this fresh, locally sourced food is now as hard as it is to come by, do student and food bank consumers even have a right to pure food? If not the federal government, whose responsibility is it to ensure that?